So there you have it, preliminary remarks before the two leaders met. Interestingly, if you look at the Trump-Modi conversation, lots of shaking of hands, embracing each other, whether this is COVID times, but you can see a much greater distance between Prime Minister Modi and President Biden. Maybe it's the sign of the times, maybe it's their first meeting, as I said, and therefore it might take a little bit of time to break the ice, or just the way Joe Biden is, in contrast to Donald Trump, who was this larger-than-life leader who liked to use his body language to make a point. But clearly, both leaders expressing pleasantries and reflecting the shared values and concerns, whether it's trade, whether it's climate change, whether it's in COVID times coming together, references to Mahatma Gandhi and democracy as well. I stopped you, Venu Rajamani, just before we heard those two statements. Your sense from the pleasantries, this is much of it really restating first principles, isn't it?
Yes, indeed. And it also restates what I was trying to say earlier, that there is much more to the relationship. To limit it to the China factor would be to do injustice to the India-US relationship. It is built on much stronger and much wider foundations. If you see these remarks, it started with a reference to family ties between Indians and Americans. It talked about the 4 million Americans, 4 million Indian Americans today in the US. There was a reference to Mahatma Gandhi by both President Biden as well as Prime Minister Modi. There was talk about technology. There was talk about democracy. President Biden talked about not just what we do together, but who we are, what we stand for, which is a reaffirmation of the fact that it is values which unite our two countries together. And then there was talk about trade. There was talk about technology. There was no mention of defense, but clearly we all know that it's an extremely important component of our bilateral relationship. And COVID, climate change, all these issues.
You said much more the conversation centered around areas of commonality, areas which will work at multiple levels. Professor Irfan Nuruddin there in Washington, your sense, is this a meeting which is perhaps being shadowed by what comes after this, the Quad? If I look at the New York Times headlines, they're all about Quad. I mean, on the front page, it's not about India as much as it's about Quad. Is Quad going to overshadow this one-on-one? Is the one-on-one a side show this time?
Absolutely, but not in a bad way. I mean, the Quad is the reason for the meeting. And it's such an important meeting because it allows for India to be part of a conversation that, as Professor Mathu pointed out, definitive of at least the next 50 years and maybe longer. We're watching in real time the creation of a new global order, the reinvention of a Cold War. We had thought, some of us, maybe that the Cold War days were over. But, there's a lot of people in Washington who I think missed the Cold War, and now this is their chance to recreate it, with China playing the role that once was occupied by the Soviet Union. That gives India a relevance in Washington that it should use to its advantage, while making sure that India's strategic interests are first and foremost. At the end of the day, in that Cold War that was the post-Second World War era, America and the Soviet Union aligned a lot of satellite countries to do their bidding. There were a lot of proxy wars fought. India is too large a country, too important a country to allow itself to be a satellite of the United States. And I think the real question from these Quad conversations is whether India sees a strategic interest in participating in the Quad that is its interest and not America's interest. The External Affairs Minister, Mr. Jaishankar, talks about multi-alignment, with echoes, of course, of the classic non-alignment doctrine, rebranded for the current age, of course. But multi-alignment means that India sees its interests as being broader than just the United States. It sees its interests, including with traditional partners like Russia. How does that interact with the Quad? So all of which is to say, the Quad is the reason for this meeting. It's an incredible opportunity for India to be at a particular conversation that is going to be quite influential going forward. But India has to be really careful to make sure that all the bonhomie, all the kind words said about shared values and other aspirational goals don't come in the way of a very close, cold reading of what its strategic interests are, and making sure that whatever happens, whatever agreements are reached,